then the international community should pay Ecuador for maintaining this biodiverse national park with oil underneath the soil. For some reason it did not play out as expected, but this is a very radical departure. So what Antonio Hidalgo Capitan and others are saying is that these proposals of Buen Vivir, who speaks here Aymara or Quechua? Anybody?
No, but I.
So how do you say Buen Vivir in Quechua?
No.
Sumacasa. Thank you. And in Aymara? Sumacamaña. Anyway, these notions are arguably the most revolutionary proposals that we have since the world systems and the different variants of dependency theories. And this is a source of inspiration when we are looking for alternative pathways to sustainable development. So in a nutshell, this was the idea, and since then, we have asked authors to reflect on the different issues which are behind it. And this is what we have. So we will start, and I will introduce the first panel. Just by saying that you have the program. The first panel will mainly deal with this special issue. Different development strategies, different outcomes, and I will just introduce Graciela Moraes Silva, who is my colleague, assistant professor in our department of anthropology and sociology at the Graduate Institute. Being Brazilian, Graciela earned her master and PhD degree in sociology at Harvard University, and she has been also, as I understand, teaching and active in the competitor, meaning the University Federal of Rio de Janeiro. So without further ado, Graciela, thank you for accepting to moderate the panel, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you, everyone. Bem-vindos. It's a pleasure to be here. I was not in the Institute yet when this project was designed, but I'm happy to be here when it's launched. We'll have an hour and a half to discuss it. I was asked to be very strict on time, so we'll be acting as a bad task. The idea is that we finish by 3:30 this first panel. We have three speakers: Humberto Campodónico, Javier Herrera, and Elizabeth Bastida. I'll introduce each of them before they speak. They'll have between 20 and 15 minutes to talk. So we start with Humberto. He's a principal researcher at the Center for the Study and Promotion of Development, DESCO, in Lima, Peru, and has served as dean and as a professor of the Faculty of Economics in the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in Lima. From 2011 and 2012, he served as the president of the National Oil Company, Petroperu. He's presently a member of the Advisory Council of the Natural Resources Governance Institute and a fellow of the Rights and Resources Initiative. He has published several books about mining, energy, oil, natural gas, international economics, and trade. Humberto, the floor is yours. I'll let you know when there are 5 minutes.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. I'm very pleased to be here to comment two papers of this book that Jill, 2 years and a little more, brought me on board with another professor, Sergio Tesano, from the University of Complutense de Madrid, in order to put this book out. So I will refer to two papers. The first one by Fernando Eguren, a Peruvian sociologist, named Socialism of the 21st Century and Neoliberalism, that analyzes the policies of Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru regarding the processes of concentration of land ownership and treatment of indigenous populations. So it's 4 countries. And then the other paper is called Commodity-Led Dependence, and it is written by Jose Antonio Ocampo, Colombian citizen, ex-minister of agriculture in Colombia, ex-head of ECLAC in Nations in Santiago de Chile. Then he was second to Kofi Annan in United Nations in the essa, Division of Social and Economic Affairs. And then he was in Columbia University with Joseph Stiglitz until recently, where he came back to Colombia to be the vice president of the Central Bank of Colombia. And his paper is Commodity-Led Development. I will start with Eguren. Well, what is very interesting in his paper is that he's taking four countries, well, two of them are socialism of 21st century, Pachamama, Buen Vivir, Sumacaucay, which is Bolivia and Ecuador, and the other ones are Colombia and Peru, which have followed neoliberal policies, broadly speaking, in the last 20 or 25 years. The major finding of Fernando's paper is the following, that in the case of concentration of land ownership, and also in what it regards the treatment of indigenous peoples, the four countries, even though they have distinctive approach in political, economic, or general philosophical context, arrive to the same conclusions and have the same patterns. And this, I am going to right now tell you some things that they develop in their paper, that he develops in their paper, and maybe afterwards we will be able to comment more about what is said here. The first one is that in Bolivia and Ecuador, there were major changes in 2005, 2006, which is the time when both Morales and Correa come into power in those countries. In both countries, you have new constitutions, and these constitutions consecrate a self-determination of the indigenous people. Bolivia is the country where the revelation of the indigenous is a central piece in the political ideology of the government, which contrasts Andean civilization or Andean world with Western civilization or Western world. In Ecuador, although the discourse on the indigenous of Rafael Correa did not have the centrality that it did have in Bolivia, unlike previous constitutions, the constitution of 2008 in Ecuador recognized the pluricultural and multi-ethnic character of Ecuadorian societies. It is different in Colombia and in Peru. In Peru, we have a neoliberal government, but I'll just read a citation from Alan Garcia, our ex-president, I am Peruvian, that is mentioned by the book, and it's called The Dog in the Manger, from Lope de Vega, or in Spanish, El Perro del Hortelano, which means, he says this, the peasant communities live in extreme poverty, expecting the state to provide all the necessary help, instead of putting their hills and lands to good economic use. Should rent or transfer, and they should rent or transfer these lands, because if these lands are not productive for them, they would be productive with a high level of investment or knowledge that would be provided by a new buyer. They are idle lands because the owner has no education or resources. Thus, his property lies dormant. The same land, sold in large lots, will bring technology that community members can also benefit from. But the ideological spider web communists, now transformed into environmentalists of the 19th century, subsists as an impediment. So this is Peru. Alan Garcia, not all of us. And in Colombia, it's very particular because of the fight with the FARC, the people moving around, being moved around because of the war, and the big latifundios that still exist in Colombia and that were not touched by policies and which will start to change now. And then the author says, while on paper, for Bolivia, while on paper the national government has recognized a broad range of indigenous rights, it has yet, or has chosen not to communicate an explicit and comprehensible message about the importance of implementing indigenous autonomy to exercise and realize those rights. One of the underlying reasons for this situation is that the indigenous autonomies contemplated have clashed with economic interests arising from extractive activities. This change embodies the breaking point that has generated the greatest impact on the decline of indigenous autonomies. So, and he says also the same thing for Ecuador. I mean, that one thing was what the presidents had in mind before they were elected, and the first years when they were elected, and then the needs of the country, quote unquote, to grow and to have more fiscal revenues and a better GDP, put them in a position very much different of where they started originally. So let's add a little salt in Buen Vivir and Pachamama and Summa Causa. You know, very nice speech and very nice overview or cosmovision. But once it has touched reality, it kind of changes. In our book, we say that it is still an aspirational concept, not an alternative model for development. But it is an aspirational concept, and it's very democratic, and it's very important. But as a model of development, it rests to be seen. In Ecuador, and for example, in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, what we have is that maybe they have differences in macroeconomic policy. So as far as extractive economic is concerned, the differences are not great. But when we see differences in political discourses and the way in which nationalism, imperialism, capitalism are talked about, then the differences are really substantive. So one thing is the macroeconomical policies, and then the other one is the speech. And just to conclude on this, because I have to go to the other papers, what Eguren says is, because these countries, Bolivia and Ecuador, depend on revenues that derive to a large extent from natural resource exports, they have little room to implement radical socio-political change. Governments depend on extractivism to fund social programs, which redistribute revenues, and to empower subordinate social sectors, redistribution of powers. Hence, the sustainability of reformist efforts is strongly dependent on the international context and the super cycle or the commodity boom, commodity prices, the boom on commodity prices. In addition, the needs of in comparison, Eguren says that liberal governments are better able to manage the tensions between their political discourse and economic options. They have to affirm their support to rural indigenous populations, but not as their core priority, because the core priority is economic improvement presented as results of economic growth made possible by neoliberal measures. I'm not agreeing very much with this last proposition, but what is important to point out is this, the result of which he wants to point out. Bolivia and Ecuador, Colombia and Peru, with different policies, finally arrive in the same kind of pattern. No, I have not gone in very much depth around land concentration, but land concentration finally is the same, or broadly, in the four countries. So that is one paper. The other one of José Antonio Campo, he says that following a period of export diversification that started in the 1960s, commodity dependence intensified again during the latest commodity price boom. He bases his article on commodity price supercycles. And he argues that resource-rich countries like ours, have not been able to capture the potential benefits associated with the latest price boom. So, in general, there are a lot of discussions here about commodity-led development and prices and booms. One of them, for example, is the following. He comes back to the Ricardian rent theory to contrast it with the Prebisch-Singer theory, which is that the Ricardian model is of agrarian rent is the following. He says, David Ricardo, that when you exploit more and more land, the land that you approach to is going to be not as good as the original one, so prices will rise. And if prices rise, then all prices will rise, and then the one who possesses the most fertile land will get a differential rent from agrarian cultivations. The same theory was supposed to be applied to the prices of our natural resource goods, copper, zinc, oil, and mining, etc. But then what Prebisch says, and he brings it back, is there will be a deterioration of our terms of trade because productivity in the north will stay over there because of the power of trade unions, etc., and will not translate itself into prices. So we in Latin America are going to have bad prices because we're not industrialized. So we are going to have to industrialize ourselves, and that is the theory that he calls, well, the imports, industrialización por sustitución de importaciones, industrialization by import substitution, which is called ISI in Spanish. And he says, one interesting thing he says is that it really should be called state-led industrialization. And not only import, because state intervenes with exchange rates, fiscal policies, permits, etc. Protectionism. So, well, but then he says, what has happened? What happens is that Prebisch-Singer theory is wrong because prices have gone up instead of going down for a century. And that is the whole core of his discussion. Why have prices gone up? Well, one of the most important factors is, of course, China. The industrialization of China needed raw materials, demand grew, prices also grew. So while China was industrializing itself, prices grew, and this Prebisch-Singer theory was questioned. What happened is, he says, what did we do during this super cycle in order to address structural problems, industrialization problems, macroeconomic problems, pro-cyclical policies? For example, if China was industrializing, did we do things to industrialize ourselves? Or did we just follow the wave and had automatic pilot policies where, well, the other theory proved wrong, we are taking along, some of us, neoliberal policies, or some others, another type of policies, but all of Latin America is growing. So what are we going to do about it? So that is very important. It's a very good paper, and I think we could discuss it later. One of the issues is commodity dependence good or bad? He says, Singer and Prebisch say that manufacturing both generates stronger linkages and is a stronger mechanism of transition to technical progress. Okay, manufacturing. But in favor of commodity dependence, it can be said that the opportunities for technical progress and linkages with both manufacturing and service sectors were behind commodity-dependent developing countries' capacity to prosper. So here he has also a very important discussion. I mean, he mentions developed countries that have been natural resource dependent countries, and that have, let's say, graduated from natural resources and have become industrialized countries. And the example is Finland, for example. No? So what he says is that we should take very much into account that we could fall into a middle income trap. And he mentions Carlota Perez, the Venezuelan economist, which studies this, and he says, Carlota Perez argues that today she is for the fact that we could use natural resources to industrialize, that there are ample technological opportunities associated with biotechnology, nanotechnology, and environmentally friendly products, opportunities to exploit the whole value chain of natural resource intensive sectors, and strong complementarities with Asia, although now with lower prices. In contrast, he says, her correct evaluation is that Latin America is too far behind in other technology sectors and is no longer a low-wage region, and so can compete neither in the high technology sectors associated with information and communication technologies, nor in low-skilled manufacturers. So the middle income trap is, we're not like Bangladesh. Our income, our salaries are higher, but we're not Belgium or Holland or France, because we don't have the human capital or the technology in order to compete in those leagues. So in the middle income trap is will be about $6,000 or $7,000 income per capita as an average, and it's very difficult to grow if we don't go into manufacturing, if we don't go into technology of information, etc. Well, that is what his paper is about. I'm mentioning what he says explicitly. So finally he says, I guess I'm going to be on time. The way forward in the context of the negative phase currently being experienced by commodity prices requires a very active strategy for the production sector, with technological development at its center. This strategy must blend an active search for production diversification with an explicit policy of reindustrialization, but also with a commitment to fully exploiting the linkages and technological opportunities provided by the region's natural resource wealth. So what he's saying is, let's not make the same thing as before. I mean, in the 60s or the 70s with ECLAC, going all the way into industrialization, leaving aside natural resource wealth and having the state completely inserted in this process. He's trying to, I think, guide us to an intermediate way. Exploit our natural resources, environmentally friendly and with social and labor license, but at the same time, let's make an effort that can only come by the state in order to industrialize and have another type of policies in order to grow, develop, and avoid this middle income trap. So that's what he says. I have other things, some graphs that maybe I can show later, and it's an interesting paper, like all the papers in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Humberto, for being perfect on time, very good. So now I'll pass the word to Javier Rivera, who's an economist, currently research director at the Development Research Institute and visiting professor at the Catholic University of Peru. He holds a doctoral degree in economics from the University of Paris and a master's degree in economics from the New School. His recent research focuses on vulnerability, poverty measurement, and dynamics and residential segregation. The floor is yours, Javier.
Okay, thank you. And I will also present another paper from someone who's not here. also related to the paper that I'm going to present. What I want to do is just give a broad picture on, comparative broad picture on Latin American countries which have implemented different growth strategies. Those who have implemented primary export strategies, and those who have tried to carry out more heterodox policies. So I want to try to take a look at the figures on poverty, inequality, and redistribution, and to see how they differ in the results of these different policies. Here in this graph, you see the reduction on poverty, which has been very important in all countries almost, with the exception of Colombia. You see here, I don't know if I can, well, I finished.
Inequality.
Which is the point. Yes. Okay. I did that. Okay. I don't know why. It's not. Okay. No problem. You see the dot points are Colombia, and the continuous line is Peru, which is one of the countries in the world that have most reduced poverty. And you see also Bolivia. I don't know where Bolivia. Okay, Bolivia also. We don't have much data here, but Bolivia also have done a very huge reduction in poverty. So we have Ecuador also. So we cannot distinguish here in the result of poverty reduction really a high contrast between countries that have carried on orthodox policies versus heterodox, with the exception of Colombia. And here also, and I put also Brazil, so you may see what's happening also with Brazil, which is for me is a kind of benchmark. On first, it has a very high inequality, and also Brazil has carried on a very important redistributive policy during the past government. So again, here you see a reduction on inequality. This is the Gini coefficient. And then again, the reduction in inequality was not so high. It was noticeable in some countries. You see, for instance, in the case of Peru, you see that the continuous line, it's a reduction, it's a relatively important reduction, but also in Ecuador and also in Bolivia, not so much at that point. No, in Bolivia it was high. The dot point is Chile, which is another country which is also having an orthodox policy on also with primary exports being the main strategy. So again, we cannot see here different results from this kind of different countries. Here you have another indicator, which is an indicator which reflects polarization. Gini coefficient only gives you how sensible is the whole distribution, and here you have an indicator that gives an idea of the importance in some sense of the middle of the distribution, which is a kind of proxy of the middle class in some sense. And if this indicator has grown, you will see that the middle class has reached or not. And again, we see a reduction on the polarization index. And there is no differentiation between these two kind of countries again. So neither in poverty, inequality, or polarization, we notice a really clear differentiated pattern between countries we have carry out orthodox versus heterodox policies. So what I was thinking about, okay, this is the broad picture, but let's take a closer look to Peru and see what happened. What we see is that a very important fluctuation on macroeconomic growth and reduced income elasticity of poverty. During the boom, you have an important poverty reduction, but now in the last 4 years, you have a very slow reduction in poverty. So that's also an important thing. There is no change in the pattern of growth. I mean, also we are relying on export of primary products, but you may have also different patterns of income and poverty reduction. And the question is, how pro-poor is the growth? Why I am asking this question? Because if you have a pro-poor growth, that means that there is redistribution, and redistribution can be done through two ways. One way is sector recomposition, that's to say whether or not during this period in manufacture or other industries that are more devoted to internal markets are growing faster or not, and also the role of policies, the social policies, the distribution of income. So what we see here is that during the first period of rapid growth, what we have observed is that most of the poverty reduction came from purely growth, almost very little redistribution. But as the growth rate was reduced, the part of the proportion of redistribution became more important in the poverty reduction. So that's an important thing, and I'm trying to think about that, and I think that this is also the consequence of the decentralization process that I will talk more about in the second paper. So I just decomposed that in 2 periods, and you will see here that during the first sub-period, redistribution, I don't see here. Okay, redistribution represented around 40% of the poverty reduction, whereas in the latest period, between 2011 and 2015, it accounted only for 26%. So it's a big difference. And now, public transfers. What is the role of social policy in Peru? And what you see in this graph is that it's really very little, because in average it represented less than 4% of expenditures. And if you decompose that by the size, I mean the 10 lowest part of the distribution, it represented around 12%, and this proportion was decreasing along the time, as you will see here in this graph. You see that it was a peak on 2006, and then it declined until 2012, and this linked to also to the political cycle in Peru. This was elections and so on. And I have made a simulation. What would happen with poverty if it was not, if there were not transfers? And the difference in between the poverty with transfers and public transfers and without is not such a high. It's 25 points against 22 points. I think 22, 23. 21.8. Yes, it's almost 4 points. That's it. So there is public transfers, but public transfers only account for 4 points of reduction on poverty, direct impact. So there is a window opportunity also to reduce poverty, because poverty has reduced very much. So if you estimate what will be the transfers that are needed to eliminate poverty, the amount was very high when poverty was very high. That's natural. But now, since poverty is low, you will need less than 5% of expenditures of the non-poor households in order to make the poor have an income and expenditure that will be sufficient to be no poor. So the poverty reduction is also a window opportunity to devote less resources, less public resources to reduce poverty. But also inequality, which remains high, is also an opportunity to reduce poverty, because if there were no inequality, it would be more difficult to redistribute. There will be very little room to redistribute. But redistribution does not depend just on the will of the government. It depends also in the feasibility, the willingness of the people to redistribute, to how do they think about inequality. So Anna will go faster in order to move to inequality and redistribution. I'm using all the surveys that can be used to do this analysis, all the Latino barometer surveys, all the world value surveys, etc. And what we see in this graph is the perception of people about how unfair is the distribution, and then comparing you will see how unfair, and the people who are here in the lightest bar is the people who think it's unfair, and the more darker is the people who think that it's just or very unjust. Unjust and very unjust. Okay. There's a little bit mistake. It's just, very just. Okay. What you see here is that, in fact, in Peru, you have people who are considering redistribution very unjust, more unjust than what are considering people who have a higher level of inequality. So there's a kind of sensibility on income distribution in Peru. But here, okay, I will go faster. It's in time. Here you have in time the different evolution. I will not comment. This is a comparative table. You will see Peru is a very an outlier, really an outlier about how unequal should be income distribution. Here, people who think that income should be more equal, most of the countries, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, think that they should be more equal. But in Peru, only 1 out of 5 people say that. 21% only think that distribution should be more. So it's a kind of weird situation, and I think this is you can explain that by the structure of the labor market. Most of the people are not wage labor, are independent workers, and the results of their work is their income, is the only effort that makes for them the results. So when you ask them about what do you think about the wealth, how the wealth is created, and they have a vision of wealth that is expandable. They don't think that the wealth is something which is given and have to be redistributed. They think that wealth is something that can be expanded. So that's also an important thing about how can it be that redistribution, and when they are asked about who should take action on this inequality, they are more prone to answer that the people should have more responsibility, individual responsibility. They are not majority asking that the government should have more responsibility. So this kind of aversion to the redistribution, but is also an important thing. And then in this graph, I'm taking, this is the Gini coefficient, and you will see what is the Gini coefficient in the primary income and the Gini coefficient after the policies of the state on redistribution and social expenditure. And what would you see here in the right points, you have the OECD and the European Union. And what is interesting to see in the dots which are to the right in the upper part is that primary income is almost as unequal in Europe as in the most unequal countries in Latin America. But it is social policy and fiscal redistribution that makes that this inequality goes down, down, and down. and there is a lot of spaces of margin in different Latin American countries to do this redistribution. In Peru, for instance, direct taxes are very low and are not really redistributed. Peruvian tax system are relying more in indirect taxes and value-added taxes, which are regressive. And also, as I have shown, public policy of redistribution, conditional cash transfers are also very low because on average you only have 3% of redistribution, only 4% of poverty reduction. So there is a lot of space to reduce poverty and inequality, but political coalitions are very hard to form because of this perception of wealth as expandable, this perception of the state having not to do this redistribution, and also the weakness of the state to have a reform on taxes. So that's what I wanted to show you, and then I will go to the second, the paper that I want to, the second paper that I have to present, and I have four, but I have shown just seconds ago. Okay. Okay. I will present very quick the second paper. And this paper is very interesting also. I found it really interesting. The subject of this paper is the underlying tension between extractivism, decentralization process, and the recognition of ethnic rights. And also he makes take the case of 4 countries, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. Again, the 2 opposite cases of heterodox versus orthodox policies. And the hypothesis, the main thing that he wanted to prove is that, in fact, this ideological fissure, as important as it appears, is not really significant in terms of the dependence of extractive industries. It really doesn't explain differences in terms of the relationship between extractivism and decentralization. And also, it not really counts in the difference on government policies regarding environment and ethnic rights. The author distinguished 2 kinds of extractivism: the ones who are relying on mining and energy products, and the other ones on agriculture, but I mean large-scale monoculture agriculture. But and then he showed that there are similar trends in export of mining and in energy in these all 4 countries, Bolivia, and Ecuador in one hand, and Colombia and Peru on the other hand. And what he finds is that the extractivism model has deepened in all of these 4 countries. So but there are differences in the way in which it is applied and it's markets and diversify production. And then he goes on to the decentralization policy to local governments, and he finds that there were different phases of implementation of this decentralization. In Colombia, it was implemented at the beginning in 1986 and then 1991. And in Peru, it was also around 2002, so the earliest implementation, whereas in Ecuador, it was only implemented in 2008, and in Bolivia, 2005. And only at the political level. And also redistribution of mining incomes differs widely among countries. For instance, in Ecuador, which is supposed to be the country with the more heterodox redistributive policies, it represented only 2%. And then you will find a more closer situation between Bolivia and Colombia. Bolivia is 40%, Colombia 35%. In the case of Peru, it's around 50%. So, and also what is important to say is that there is no sharing mechanism on local governments that are not within the range of mining industries. I mean, local places, districts, or regions that do not have a mine within their limits are not benefiting with this transfer of royalties to the local governments. And then he moved to the last thing that he takes into account, which is the environment. And again, he finds no clear pattern between these two kind of strategies of growth. You have, for instance, that Peru have a lower proportion of surface under protection than Bolivia. Bolivia and Colombia have almost the same, and all the three have a very lower proportion than Ecuador. So again, no clear pattern of differences in this environment protection, no clear pattern on redistribution, no clear pattern on decentralization, and all of the countries have deepened their dependence on mining and agricultural exports. So that's his main conclusion.
She's a senior lecturer at the Center for Energy, Petroleum and Mineral Law and Policy at the School of Social Sciences, University of Philippines. Elizabeth Plácida specializes in law, policy, and the governance of the environment and natural resources in the context of sustainable development.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to join with the chapter to the book and to the launch of the book. I am really delighted to be here. It is an honor and a pleasure for me. So I am going to give a very brief summary of my book, my paper, and the findings of the paper that I wrote with Burgos, which is an associate professor at Universidad Externado de Colombia. So the starting point of the paper is called Regimes for Sustainable Mineral Resource Management, Constitutional Reform, Law and Judicial Decisions in Latin America. And the starting point is the traditional sectoral regimes. So mining laws in the region in Latin America being such a historical and controversial activity. So mining law has been, it is deeply rooted in history, in traditional patterns. There are traditional patterns of legislation in which the laws enacted in the 90s are based on. So if the current legislation is still rooted in those historical patterns, in general terms, we will see in the next 10 minutes that it is changing. This is gradually changing and rapidly changing as well. So that is very important. That is a transformational change that we can see at the end of the paper. But in this part, the starting point is this historical legislation, the basis of these historical laws that are focused around the concession system for granting access to community, anything in these old regimes, and then they are centralized regimes. So that is assumed that there are centralized patterns of decision making when granting these types of rights. So the question is to what extent these regimes are transformed when interpreted or redesigned in the context of subsequent constitutional reforms that have been very important in Latin America and that have, in most cases, embraced sustainable development in the form of the embracing the protection of environmental rights, human rights, and also in the context of decentralization processes that have been very important in most countries in Latin America. And so that are important decisions taken at the level of local governments or closest to the problems and to those affected by projects are an important aspect of sustainable development. So in terms of law, social and economic dimensions. So these are all dimensions that are being brought about by different legal regimes and that have been embraced gradually by constitutional change. And so the important question is how they are changing and they are challenging the basic principles of these historical sectoral regimes in the mining sector. So the main country that we analyzed it was the legislation and the decisions of the Constitutional Court of Colombia. So we started with Colombia as an important case study, first because it is very rich in terms of the decisions of the Constitutional Court. So the political constitution is from 1991. So it was very sort of it proclaimed Colombia as a decentralized democratic state. It droned a decentralized territorial morphology that contrasted with the centralized state that it was in 1991, and recognized an important fundamental bill of rights, and also established a role for constitutional courts that have a role when constitutional rights are challenged. So that's why it is very interesting for our case study, because if we want to look at the transformation of law and so through how the Constitutional Court has interpreted these different principles coming from legislation, the traditional sectoral legislation, when interpreting other systems, other regimes, environmental regimes, the all decentralization, the structure of the state. So it is quite long, but we have detail. You can find the details in the paper. But I will point at the three sets of cases that are quite interesting. The first set is it is the first decision of the Constitutional Court decided on banning mining from moorlands or páramos, would be in Spanish. So páramos are very, very rich, important reserves of water, have a very important role for ecosystems. And this decision of the Constitutional Court is important because the banning of mining from moorlands, it happens, so it has been interpreted also in relation to concession holders with acquired rights. This is quite unique in Colombia because Colombia has never had no expropriation cases, so has always upheld the rights of investor rights, the investor rights over other rights. So in this case, has interpreted that environmental protection through the protection of moorlands has to prevail. So it has in pondering different rights protected by constitution. It interpreted that it had to the environmental protection to prevail. So this is one of the important judgments. Another set of important judgments is related to the question of upholding the prior consultation to ethnic communities. That has been recognized by the Constitution and also by the Code of Mines. But there is a set of cases that are pointing at the importance of upholding prior consultation with communities as an avenue to obtain consent. So it is definitely, so if we are thinking of processes of decision making, the question of including communities, ethnic communities, as they are called in Colombia, within these processes, it is definitely a very important change. So they are included, and there are very important, very clear parameters on the way they have to be included, and the scope and the objective of the consultation processes. And then another set of these this type of judgments is on the participation of territorial entities in land use decisions about mining. And this is again very interesting because so there is an article in the mining code that all these decisions point at the unconstitutionality of this article. This article, Article 37, bans or excludes regional and local authorities from mining from their territories. And that has become a very, very important question in not only in Colombia, but in many cases in Argentina, for example, it's a big question. So that has been sort of informal referendums with local populations to see the local population and the local government would accept mining in their territories or not. In the case of Colombia, there have been these court cases. The first court case decided that that there has to be reasonable participation of territorial entities, and so the court called the different levels of government to talk to each other. So that is sort of this dialogical role for the courts. The court decision sort of is asking not only to talk, to have this intercultural dialogue with communities, but it's also asking different levels of government to coordinate the decision-making process. It is a very important role for courts. And then the last claim is about the Constitution. It's a claim, it's not a decision, but I thought it is interesting because it's a claim about the declaration of public utility of mining that is in the mining code. So that is a claim that it was not accepted because of procedural questions, but the question is whether this over-inclusive definition of mining as a public utility in all the phases, it is constitutional even. So that is interesting to see what is going to happen if there is another case that is brought to the court. Then there are a few questions that I'm going to summarize about that, but then on Bolivia, in Bolivia, we analyze law, the law, because there is not that this set of court decisions that to analyze. So the Constitutional Court has not been active, and so the pronouncements have been very specific on specific questions. So the main source of analysis in our paper has been on the laws, and it is very rich. I think there, if looking at the question of the transformation of the law applicable to natural resources, I think that is definitely the transformation of the principles and concepts in Bolivia, because sort of the starting point is the principle of living well, of Camaya, and then how this principle is being translated in the framework law of Mother Earth and holistic development for living well. That it is going to be interesting to see how courts eventually interpret the framework law of Mother Earth, for example, with extraction, with the fact of extraction. But I have never seen a constitution that deals so much and to such an extent on mining as the Bolivian constitution, because it is all, so it emphasizes the link between mining and industrialization and the use of revenues for poverty reduction or elimination. So it is very rich in that sense. It is very important, the link, and we think in this question around the concept of sustainable development, it has so many examples of it. And even then later, the 2014 law of mining and metallurgy also has embraced the concept, and it is one of the only laws as well that, for example, acknowledges the rights of indigenous peoples, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it's very progressive law. The question is, I would say that, as Humberto said, probably it is at this extent, is at this stage, looks aspirational. So it is what is emerging. I think it needs more study, so more further research. I think that in this part of our paper is a starting point, but needs further research. I think there are many questions that come out there, and even the literature is pointing at problems in the participation processes, in the consultation with local communities. A lot of focus on compensation, rather than on effective and meaningful participation and benefits. So there are few questions here and there to look at. So I would say that what are the findings, I think, that, of this study? I think that I really liked a paper I read from Santalla Quintero, someone who commented on Colombia particularly, an author, very interesting author. So he pointed at the constitutionalization gap. No? So I think that is the amount, the extent of conflict, particularly when looking at cases as Colombia, the amount and extent of conflicts brought to the Constitutional Court are evident at the local, what institutions are there at the local level to manage impacts and to create development at that level. So that has never been designed. Institutions have never been designed from below. They have always been designed from above, have centralized. So I would say that it is a question to explore in further research. I think that it is an important question there. Then there are other gaps. It's called the legal harmonization gap, the deficit de armonización between the different legislations. Due to the fragmentation of different legal regimes, I think that the core decisions that I just mentioned, they tell you about that, the fragmentation of different regimes. And then, of course, this leads to a gap in local capacity for effective participation. So I would say that gradually or radically, there is we can see transformation, at least in principle, on the law applicable to natural resources, and a very, I would say, we have gone a long way, at least in principle, from this focus and unidimensional decision-making processes involving historical legislation.
Thank you very much to the three panelists. It will give us half an hour for questions and answers, so I bet Scott's question was worth it. So now we'll open the floor to questions, comments.
With what we inherited from colonial times. And I'm sure I don't have to tell everyone what we've been through, but the thing that in terms of hard commodities, what we're talking about mining, the challenge is extraction has been given to foreign capital. And in this point, Fernanda Henrique Cardoso was very much in charge of doing this kind of thing. And in terms of soft commodities, that is agricultural commodities, the problem that we inherited was, and this one is really connected to colonialism, land ownership. Because it's so concentrated that all the capital we have to invest in commodity production is also concentrated. So taking advantage in a very, in the way of achieving, alleviating inequality is very, very challenging. And I think it would be very naive to associate it with Finland progress in the latest time. I just came from Finland, and I got to know that their pathway is quite different from what we have experienced. In very short, if I have time for that, the thing is, Finland is just between two empires, former empires, that's Sweden and Russia. It was taken by the two and disputed by the two. So for security reasons, all the naval industry for Russia and the Soviet rule was in Finland. So they inherited a lot of knowledge on building machines. And when the Soviet powers was over, so the Swedish, to protect it against another invasion, invested massively on education. So, and there's a third point for Finland. Forests are public. So the forest industry developed from the engineering knowledge they inherited from the naval industry, but also with massive government support, including access into the forest. Okay, all this said, I wonder, why do we have an interview with Fernando Henrique Cardoso in this book that talks about transformative policies? Thank you very much.
One will ask the more questions.
Sí, ¿no hay answer? Bueno,
But I can also reply to that.
Okay.
You have to.
I think we
Yeah.
have 3 more questions before we're done.
Well, first of all, congratulations for all panelists and Gilles and his team to be tackling such a very interesting issues. And I just have a quick look at the article. It's very interesting. The presentations were very exciting. There's a lot of food for thought in there. And I don't know if I have a question or just a provocation or just exercising my, it's interesting sometimes to play the devil's advocate. So just to kind of comment, and I want to hear some reactions to that. I was just wondering while you were talking, you had just mentioned, basically we were talking about Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. I mean, you were talking about countries with large majorities of indigenous populations, and there's the whole hype with the thing of buen vivir and being friendly to the environment. But sometimes I just wonder if there's not just a distraction, and at the end of the day, we are just kind of distracting ourselves from the real issue, which is how to change the material basis of our liberty. I mean, to use Bakunin's words, in the sense, for instance, we are all using here cell phones, and China, for instance, has like 1 billion cell phones. Brazil has 200 million cell phones by the end of this year. And 2050, China wants to have the same pattern of consumption as the United States and other countries, developed countries, which will certainly have a very immense impact in the extraction in Latin America. So, how do you think about it? Maybe we are just distracting ourselves from the very raw debate about big corporations carrying on with their activities and extracting and selling stuff, and how do you deal with that? Thank you.
So I'll get one more question. You have to raise your hand, people, and then I'll go back to the panelists.
Thanks to all the panelists. This is a question coming to Umberto Capodorico, and it's about what you mentioned concerning the concept of buen vivir. You said that at the end it was more of an aspirational concept. And I wonder whether it's not a political ideology similar to what we heard in the 90s in East Asia about the Asian values. Don't you think that since it is connected to the socialism of the 21st century, it would be more of a political ideology than an aspirational concept? Because, as you mentioned, at the end, the results are very similar to the results of those orthodox economies such as Chile, Colombia, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. The word to Umberto in the start.
okay, fine, I'll take it. Yes. let's see. I think that the whole discussion about alternative development models, maybe we don't even have to call them models, but alternative development strategies or issues, etc. First, I'm going to say some things that Ocampo says, then I can say what I think. Okay. What he is trying to say is that that we need industrialization, that we don't need it in the same way that it was applied 30 or 40 years ago, that we have gone through a process of deindustrialization, not because there is less industry, but because natural resources grew more and they take a bigger part of GDP right now, so there is a relative disindustrialization, and that if we don't go, and that we have not learned the lessons of how to deal with shocks and external shocks and prices and etc. And then he has some things about theories of long waves and cycles, etc. But concerning the development, what he says is that we have to go into industrialization, and that we cannot rule out completely the use of natural resources in order to industrialize ourselves. One thing that is not on the article of Ocampo is Finland, I put it, which I take the full account for that, okay? But what he's saying is to take into account that Chile has done it, but then other countries that do not have natural resources, like South Korea or Japan, have industrialized themselves without having natural resources. Excuse me?
Chile is dedicated from this.
No, but Chile has had a very important development of natural resources like wood, salmon, wine, and others. I don't think, it's not a developed country, but I mean, it has had, so we should not leave this behind. So that's one point. Then what you say about soft commodities and hard commodities is also very important. Soft commodities have more employment. They are also very concentrated in land, etc. Hard commodities are mostly foreign owned, for foreign investment, not all the time. So, I mean, what he's trying to say is, if we depend on these commodities, which have cycles, and we do not profit from them, then we cannot do that. But he does not say that we should leave aside commodities, mining or oil, gas, or soft commodities, and that we should do something else. That he does not say. Okay, so that's one thing. I think that what I try to put up is that we have to think about what are the alternative strategies or models of development, and then I go into the second. I will take that Cardoso thing afterwards. About distraction being brought by, let's say, alternative ideologies of buen vivir or sumar causa, while we have big corporations that have foreign investment and mining, etc. And what we said about an aspirational concept. I mean, if you look at it as a path for development, I think it's very important the fact that it goes into the same thing of human development. I mean, UNDP, United Nations, that has this el desarrollo humano, human development. So it's the same kind of thing that putting the people in the center, putting people in as the most important factor. So what Buen Vivir says is that putting people, indigenous people with a cosmovision that is different, that wants to respect land, water, etc., is very important, because then you change all the logics of extractivism or of industrialization. We have not yet talked about climate change, which is, let's say, what comes out of these models of development is climate change. So progress was supposed to be technical and lead us to emancipation, and now we know that it is not doing that. But I think that as a concept, as a democratization of putting ethnic values of people that have been oppressed for centuries, etc., is very good, very valid, very democratic. But that does not make a model of development for me. And I am answering also for others. I mean, and once it has been put into a pressure or in the government seat, it has demonstrated that it didn't go the way it was said initially. You can see it in Ecuador now with Yasuni, ITT, etc., which is going to be exploited, those oil resources that were supposed not to be exploited. Then there is a lot of fights with indigenous people in Ecuador, and also in Bolivia. In Bolivia, if I start talking about the quantity of laws, indigenous laws, consulta previa, previous consultation, etc., they have been rolled down in order to exploit resources in Madre de Dios and Beni, because the government needs the money to do. They have very important social programs for little kids, for retirados, pension fund, etc. So, when they have confronted themselves with reality, Buen Vivir and Pachamama cannot be in the driver's seat, So that's why I say it's very difficult to put it as a model of development, as an aspirational concept, or as it has been said here, a political ideology. I would say so, yes, as a political ideology, and which I think is progressive, but let's not make it a model of development. It's very difficult to put that in Brazil or in Colombia or I don't know, or in other countries where you don't have a lot of indigenous people. But as an aspirational concept, as a democratic thing, yes, I do think it's very important. Now, concerning Cardoso, I think Jill will answer that.
Yeah, very quickly. Actually, when we started to do that, I said, well, I'm a development economist, and I've been studying development economics in the 80s, where we were completely infused by Pareto, Cardoso, Los Santos, and others. So I said, well, I have the chance now to be editor-in-chief of this journal. Let me invite these guys and engage. And my question was mainly, we want to look at Suma Samai, we want to look at Suma Kamania, we want to look at alternative models now. What has been drawn? What were the inspiration that maybe went through Europe and the US and back and then emerged from a more local level? Is it completely, separate, or can you see somehow how ideas have traveled and come back? So that was my major question, and what we did actually, that we proposed to both Fernando Enrique Cardoso and Antonio Dos Santos to provide 2 articles that would launch a bit this session. And you know how things go. First, Mr. Cardoso says no, and Antonio Dos Santos provides a draft and comes to Geneva 2 days to discuss with the author workshop, which was fascinating. And he wrote a good draft, but all of that went to peer review, and we tried to get the Antonio's piece completed and finalized, and we treat all of our authors the same way. And when an author does not deliver the final product after revise and resubmit, even if so unfortunately we didn't get the piece on time to be printed in this volume from the Dos Santos. But suddenly after a couple of months we got the news that Mr. Cardoso would not write a paper, but would be happy to respond to questions which are the questions that we are dealing with in this issue, and provide further views. So we were still thinking to have both, and to have one article and one interview, and we ended up with the interview finalized and not the others. And then the logic, and this is maybe the conclusion, is that okay, that's life. We go with it, but we don't. As I told you, we will sell probably 1,200 books, but we might have a number of these articles downloaded 20,000 times. So we don't think of that just as a volume and what does this interview do with the volume. This interview will, circulate on the web, be downloaded maybe in China or in South Africa, and might be of interest to some people who don't, they select each paper which is of their own interest. And it's very, just a very few of them, they decide to download the whole volume. So, it's not a satisfactory response, but I think it's the response I can give.
But
And then just to go back.
We do have the article in Spanish. So
From Teotonio.
From Teotonio.
Yes.
So that would be in the web when it's published in Spanish.
It will be published in Spanish. But it was too late for the translation. Finally, I think what we did is what I think this question of when we leave. We have a lot of discussion in France about la décroissance, degrowth, but this is a discussion that you can have in universities sometimes, but most of the time outside of universities where you get a few well-known people, but it never trickles down into politics. And here in Latin America, you have suddenly in Ecuador, in Bolivia, governments who say, well, we will get inspiration from strong ecological sustainability, from a mixture between what comes from the wisdom of indigenous people and another understanding of the relationship between mankind and nature, and they are in power. So this is absolutely very interesting to see, for instance, with Elizabeth, to say how does this translate into constitutions, from there into decisions by the Constitutional Court. Or what Javier said, how does it translate into differences in land concentration, poverty alleviation, recognition of inequality, indigenous people's rights, etc. And this is what we wanted to explore because of this, innovations, political innovations in Latin America. And what you hear back is that it's maybe too short to judge after 500 years, an experiment of a few years in Bolivia and Ecuador, but it's disturbing that with so diverging narratives and strategies, we see so little difference in actual outcomes.
Right.
That's maybe one point where we still need to reflect more and to see how this will evolve. But this was kind of the disturbing results of the findings of several of the authors who have done the research.
Just one point also about decentralization and as a way to redistribute income. And you have in both kind of countries this mechanism of redistribution. In Peru, for instance, you have a more important proportion of income coming from mining to be redistributed at the local level than in other countries that are carrying on more heterodox policies, like for instance Ecuador. And this kind of policies you have to compare with other kind of redistribution, which is called conditional cash transfers also, that unlike Brazil, in these four countries are not taking really very big importance. So I think that again, this mechanism of direct transfer versus indirect transfers through royalties are also not a clear-cut criteria to distinguish these two kind of countries. But at the same time, what we know is that this cycle of prices, mining prices, primary commodity prices is almost finished, despite that is very little regain. And so we don't know if we have lost definitively this opportunity. It was a window, historical opportunity, which is now finished. And now what on? What are the alternatives? And the alternatives are what Humberto have mentioned, the regain of the strategy of product diversification, which does not mean abandoning development of mining investment, perhaps transforming them as to be more social responsible with the environment, with the local communities, but at the same time promote policies that diversify the economy, making that industries that are oriented to the internal market are more important than in the past, so as to redistribute through growth, but at the same time through this kind of sectoral composition of growth, but at the same time through direct transfers to people.
Okay, so I respond to your question on whether we are distracted by focusing on these concepts on other questions, like the question of how to change the material basis of society that you pointed out. I think that it is a very important question, but I would say that that type of question would require regional and to link up with global dialogues. It is a question that is related to sustainable patterns of consumption and production. And I think that it's not, I haven't seen much in the literature or in debates about in Latin America a discussion about that. So I have seen in Europe, in the EU, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about the role of minerals in the transition to low carbon economies, for example. That has been really very important question in the vision on, at least in my mind, that it is what I've been working on. There is not regional vision, and that in a regional vision, in work, sort of on vision about the sector at the regional level, these are the questions that can be worked out, and I think that is very important. In Africa, there is a forum, an African mining vision, that looked at minerals as source of industrialization, and it says that they want minerals as a basis for knowledge societies. So it is saying from the starting point that they don't want to be, they don't want to rely on being an extractive economies always. So that it is an extractive economies as a way to knowledge societies. That is very important as a regional vision, I thought. And so that is, it has been guiding the important work. There has not been that type of dialogue at the regional level. And I think that regional dialogue would be very rich, because that regional dialogue should bring these concepts there. So what it means, summa camania in the living and this type of concepts around these type of dialogues. So it is a way to link up your question with this other broader question, I would say.
We have time for a quick second round of questions. I have Andina already.
Hello. Thank you for your presentations. I have two questions. One for Professor Herrera. I've been struggling with this thing of extractivism. So I wonder if how good is it to judge extractivism, because sometimes at the end some countries just accept the fact that they have to have this model of extractivism. For example, Chile and Peru, they acknowledge through their presidencies and ministries that they have this economic model that supports extractivism. And then they're just trying to look for another option. So I don't know if it's all right for countries like those I mentioned to just accept that their economics are based on extractivism, and they should just follow different options. I mean, alternative options. So I'm just wondering if it is really good to make this kind of reflection or not. How good is that? To go on that topic. And the second question goes to Professor Elizabeth Bastida. It's really interesting what you brought here about the Colombian Constitutional Court. So I was wondering if in your paper you asked for the political aspects behind social consultations, because from the legal perspective it looks nice to have this kind of consultation, but sometimes it's not as happy as it seems, because there are political struggles. So I wonder if you probably could explore that topic. I'm sorry, Professor Herrera, if my question is not very clear, probably. ¿Puedo decirlo en español? Me pregunto si está bien hacer este tipo de aproximaciones o de reflexiones donde se quiere repudiar un modelo económico extractivista, o si es simplemente mejor que países como Chile y como Perú acepten que son extractivistas sus modelos económicos y busquen una opción diferente. O ninguno de los dos idiomas. O podemos hablar luego.
Hello, my name is Roberta. I'm a professor at the Fluminense Federal University. The presentations were very interesting, and I have a question to Professor Herrera. Here in Brazil, I'm a political scientist, not an economist, but I'm interested in the debate. Here in Brazil, there is a debate among economists on the reasons why poverty has decreased during Lula and Dilma Rousseff's governance. Not inequality, but poverty. And though Bolsa Família is very famous, other factors are indicated as the reasons why poverty has decreased. And they are the increase of employment in the formal sector and the increase in minimum wage. And the increase in the minimum wage, of course, is public policy. I would like to ask you if those features, if those policies were followed in the other Latin American countries and South American countries specifically as well. I know that in Argentina there were similar policies. I don't know about the rest, if they were important or not. Thank you.
I am in the list. I will be
I'm going to speak later, but I just had a question that's been kind of going around in my head because there's a topic that hasn't been on the table, but particularly when we talk about Bolivia and to some extent Peru, it's sort of there in the background, which is the role of small-scale or artisanal mining or cooperative mining. And when you tell me that Bolivia is no different than Peru in terms of certain outcomes, I think there's a big difference there in terms of the administration handing to cooperatives a significant amount of power and resources by directly extracting minerals. In Peru, it's not been government policy, but it's happened in a huge way anyway. It's a huge factor in generating income for formerly low-income people through directly involved in small-scale mining activities that connect to a larger chain. Where does that come in? I mean, between extractivism and anti-extractivism, we have this whole sphere of small and artisanal miners that is developed in most of the countries. Where does that fit, or should it fit in a vision for mining and development?
I'll try to be quick. It's actually a follow-up point on Roberta's, right? Point. Because I thought it was fascinating also your graph on how there's not that much difference in terms of the performance in Chinese Latin American countries. And basically the point we're making is that it's much more related to economic growth, which is something that Ricardo Paes de Barros had made similar type of argument in the case of Brazil. But then looking historically, there's been many other periods in Latin America where there's been economic growth without redistribution. So one could argue along the lines of Branko Milanovic that economic growth is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So in that sense, is there anything else that's been in common in terms of in political terms in the Latin American countries, maybe along jobs or, I don't know, social grants, conditional transfers, that we could look to find the patterns, and it's not simply an argument that it's about economic growth. So let's make the cake well, just split it. And on the other hand, I really enjoyed reading the introduction and some of the pieces, but I keep thinking that there's a lot on socioeconomic inequality and other types of measures and environment, but there is a measure of political inequality that is very hard to measure. And I do think that there is a big difference in terms of how political actors feel entitled, and there are new political actors in the space that can make new types of programs that maybe are not going to be measurable in a decade, but in the long run might make a big difference in terms of the types of demands that can get to the policy level. Can you just agree with that? Let's go back.
Yeah, so the question is the following. If the strategies were different but the results were kind of similar, what would be then the lessons that Latin America can give to other regions, countries? Thank you.
Okay, no.
So now the question is specifically was on the question on if we look at political aspects behind the legal decisions. So here we say, despite developments in judicial decisions, we say that in America, the literature points to delay from the executive and legislative powers in their advance towards a mandatory and binding enforcement of prior consultation. So it is exactly that. It is, the paper is focused on judicial decisions, and actually, so as we looked at legal type of literature, we look at the question of, as well, on the need for lawyers, so at the limits of the work for lawyers that we discussed that before. So when there is a requirement for intercultural dialogue, so lawyers do not have the skills, have not been trained for that, and so there is a need for interdisciplinary work that is calling upon lawyers to work with other disciplines. So I think the type of this kind of literature that I dealt with, but of course I haven't worked with the political literature. It's extremely rich.
I will begin backwards, starting by Garcia. Say growth is a necessary condition but not sufficient. But you will find some experiences in countries in which growth is not even necessary, but you can have also redistribution policies. In many countries you have that. Why it could be possible? Because first, poverty has been reduced very deeply, so the amount to be redistributed to lift these people out of poverty is not so much, and also because there is a lot of room to do this. If you compare, as I did, countries with high inequality with other countries with high inequality in their primary incomes, you will see that countries may succeed to reduce this inequality in order to reduce also poverty. And this is without having growth inside. So it is also possible to reduce growth through reduce poverty through distribution, but that will imply to have a social arrangement that change the rules of fiscal policy and how it should be the distribution to people with lower incomes. And there are some countries with more favorable opinions to that, I mean more favorable political correlation of forces to do more redistribution. In the case of Peru, my point of view is rather pessimistic because of the structure of forced labor, using contamination of the rivers, etc. So again, looking at the more local level, but also the aggregate level, I think that we should more focus on also in other kind of strategies, like for instance small scale export agriculture. We have very huge firms doing this, but also it could be developed at a more local level, like biological, organic products like quinoa, maca, and there's a lot of products that can be developed and make that redistribution to this kind of growth, even without going out to the industrialization, may have also redistributed impacts. And then concerning the question on Brazil, well, I don't know if I shown a graph in Peru also. The main force driving reduction in poverty was increase of the enforcement of laws, and with a state capacity which is such low, and also the unwillingness to do that makes that you may observe high proportion of informal workers even in large formal enterprises. So I think that is an important thing, and also minimum wage for the same reason have very low impact on incomes for the informal sector. So I think that the strategy that Brazil have taken is not such easily transposable to other countries. And then finally, about your question, if I understood, I don't know. Well, on Peru, for instance, they support extractivism, but I mean, there are many ways in which even supporting extractivism, the impacts of this are different. And the paper that I commented showed that. For instance, in the case of Peru, you have really a policy enforcing, in some sense, primary export-led growth, but at the same time you have a kind of decentralization of resources, in particularly canon, which is the royalties that are given to the local government, which is one of the highest of the region. And this has also an impact on growth at the local level, and since mines are precisely in the highlands where the poorest people live, that also have implicitly a redistributive impact, and that you could compare with other countries in which such a configuration is not the same. Ecuador had a very, very little redistribution through decentralization, although it's kind of SUNAC, etc. So I think that there is a way to accept, as you said, extractivism, but in two directions, transform this situation, one with, at the same time, as has been mentioned, develop internal market-oriented production, and also industrialization for exports, transformation of products to be exported by producers which are in the poorest regions of the country. So I think that that could be very complex.
Thank you for your report. Understanding me, sorry. Thank you.
Well, I would like to reflect just very little in the question of what are the lessons that Latin America can give. I don't think that we are in the state to give lessons, really. What I think is that, I mean, the whole world, also the developed world, developed quote unquote, is in big trouble. We're not talking here about the big crisis, the Great Depression, or the recession, or what is going, the climate change, and then all problems brought in by globalization. Look what is happening to free trade, quote unquote, what happened in the United States with Trump, what's happening with the nation states, the European Union, Brexit, migration, etc. I mean, what is happening? I would like to go into what some theorists say, like Wallerstein or maybe Chomsky, or, you know, I mean, but there has to be, I mean, there is a big problem in the world. I mean, free trade was supposed to be the comparative advantage, nobody would question it. And now look at the United States winning by a small margin, Trump, because Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which are blue states, worker states, were abandoned, and there, that was the industrial belt. It converted itself into the Rust Belt with crimes, drug addiction, death, suicides, divorces, etc. And he touched that question. And he barely won. But he won. Okay. And so, but I mean, I think this is very, very important. And then us, what I mean, our governments thought, maybe not the Bolivia and Ecuador, but they thought, oh, we have a long cycle of prices that are growing. China is going to grow for 25 years, and then India. So we don't need industrialization. We'll just keep the automatic pilot, and we'll do it. I mean, it will grow. I mean, it will trickle down. But we have this growth. Why do we have to worry about other things? And many didn't. I mean, I think most of our governments didn't worry about that diversification. Then another subject that unifies orthodox and heterodox: corruption. In Brazil, leads the way, in a way. And then you have Argentina, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador now. The vice president, I think, is in prison already. We have 2 vice presidents in prison and more coming. And the vice president and the president of Ecuador said, we don't lose the hope of having the president in jail. So, then now, Mexico,
Neither do I.
Yeah, okay. So we thought about this with Jill. You know, we don't have a paper about corruption. We were going to include one, finally we couldn't, because corruption is permeable. I mean, it goes all over the way. So I think that if we want to, I don't know if we want to put a model of development or not, but I would say before it was growth is important, but not all of it. Then we have to have a mix of state and market, and I would say also of industrial diversification or productive diversification, and honesty, and then political movements with grassroots, etc. I mean, I don't think we could go farther than, you know, create a new model that it starts like this and ends like that with intermediate pathways along the way. I think, I don't think it is feasible now. I don't think it is feasible in the world either. But any case, I am very moved here because the questions are really putting us in a situation where we have to try to answer, and we're doing our best. Thank you.
Johnny, thank you, the panelists. Directly to the second.
I propose that while the panel changes, we can take 5 minutes break, fresh air, coffee. Maybe 5 minutes we continue with the panel on China.
Thank you. Yes, I have this, so I can acá puedo poner mi cosa. Bueno, y este libro, no.
What can we learn? There is no difference.
and in Uruguay. And one of the big distinctions that we have is they lead the change, it's important to keep it reviewed. And even says that the distribution can create economic growth, but the business leads insists on that the causality is on the other way around.
For growth, you need to which means that there is reduced connection of labor, because labor is key and implies very high cost, and you find, so. But that's a concurrent
Yeah. Very interesting study by tried to show how Latin America was a continent where they would have more labor regulation using of course preservatives and more now with the change in the
like 50% in the formal production, but 20% additional in the formal.
Tá gravando? Tá vendo tudo aqui.
Podia dar um pause pra começar?
Pode dar? Não sei, eu nunca dei pausa não.